There's something uniquely unsettling about urban wilderness. Those pockets of forest that survive within city limits, neither truly wild nor fully tamed. Riverside Park sits like a dark island in the heart of our city, roughly a square mile of dense woodland squeezed between residential neighborhoods and shopping centers. During daylight hours, it's a typical suburban park, but after sunset, it becomes something else entirely. The park's geography creates a natural bowl shape, with elevated entrances at the north and south ends sloping down to meet in a shadowed valley. The playground occupies the northern ridge, bordered by forest on two sides, with a swing set positioned almost defiantly close to the fence line, just 10 feet from where civilization ends and something older begins. I've always been drawn to empty spaces, not out of misanthropy, but because there's a certain peace and solitude that you can't find anywhere else. That's why I started my midnight swinging ritual, visiting the park between 9 and midnight when the families and dog walkers have all gone home. The steady back and forth motion becomes meditative, and in those quiet hours, you can almost convince yourself you're the last person on earth. The night everything changed was in late autumn, when the trees had mostly shed their leaves, but winter hadn't yet stripped all the color from the world. The moon was playing hide-and-seek behind thin clouds, casting just enough light to transform familiar shapes into suggestions of themselves. I'd been swinging for maybe an hour, lost in thought, when I first heard the shuffling. Initially, I didn't pay it much attention. The forest that borders the playground is home to all sorts of wildlife: deer, raccoons, the occasional mountain lion. We've got warning signs about the big cats posted at every entrance, though I've never actually seen one in the park. They generally keep to themselves, and despite their fearsome reputation, they're not typically interested in confronting humans. But this shuffling was different somehow. It had weight to it, purpose. It sounded roughly human-sized, which immediately set off warning bells in my head. My first thought was mountain lion, but the movement pattern wasn't quite right. My second thought was that someone else had decided to visit the park after hours, but that didn't quite fit either. The sound stayed consistently 10 feet away, right behind the fence, as if whatever was making it wanted to maintain that exact distance. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It wasn't exactly a growl, nothing so easily categorizable. Instead, it was something between a moan and a whisper, lasting for what felt like 5 eternal seconds. The sound seemed to exist in impossible space. While the shuffling had come from some distance away, this vocalization emanated from directly behind the fence, mere feet from where I swung through the night air. The most unsettling part wasn't the sound itself, but how it seemed to defy the basic laws of physics. How could something make noise from right beside me while simultaneously moving away in the distance? It was as if whatever was out there existed in two places at once, or perhaps was large enough to span the distance without my being able to see it. Any rational person would have left immediately. But there's something about experiencing the impossible that short-circuits normal responses. I found myself continuing to swing, as if maintaining this mundane action might somehow preserve the normal world I thought I knew. In retrospect, this was perhaps the most foolish decision I could have made, but fear sometimes masquerades as fascination. Then came the light. At first, it was just a distant pinprick near where the playground meets the street, maybe 60 or 70 feet away. Through the maze of play structures and equipment, it looked like a floating star. My first thought was that it must be a police officer. The playground was technically closed due to COVID restrictions, though in years of after-hours swinging, I'd never been bothered by law enforcement. But as the light drew closer, something about its movement set off alarms in my subconscious. If you imagine the playground as a clock face with my swing at 6 o'clock, the light had started at 12 and was moving toward 7. An unnaturally precise trajectory that seemed more calculated than casual patrol. The picnic shelter provided my only option for concealment. a 20 by 20 metal overhang with one of those mesh pattern tables underneath. In daylight it would have offered no protection at all, but in the dim moonlight, a person crouched behind it would blend into the general mass of shadows. I abandoned my swing mid-arc and moved as quietly as possible into position. That's when I got my first clear look at the figure carrying the light, and everything I thought I knew about my familiar park shifted sideways. The figure that emerged from the darkness looked like something out of a fever dream or an urban legend come to life. Despite the poor visibility, certain details stood out with unsettling clarity. They were dressed like some kind of survivalist or hunter, but not in any conventional sense. Their clothing seemed purposeful, almost ritualistic. Baggy pants that allowed for easy movement, a tactical vest covered in pouches and attachments, and a duck-billed cap that cast their face in deeper shadow. What truly set them apart were the objects strapped to their arms and legs, things I couldn't quite make out in the darkness, but which seemed to shift and catch what little moonlight there was in ways that made no logical sense. In one hand, they carried a flashlight aimed at the ground, casting a pool of light that seemed to move unnaturally across the earth. In their other hand was something that resembled a ceremonial baton or rod, its purpose as mysterious as its bearer. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If this person was indeed some kind of hunter, then a lone figure swinging in the midnight darkness must have looked like either prey or bait. My pale skin would have been clearly visible in the moonlight, making me a beacon for whatever this person was seeking, or whatever might be seeking them. My mind raced through my options. The forest beckoned behind me. Despite its relatively small size, I knew every inch of it from 20 years of exploration. I'd wandered these woods since I was 7 years old, learning its secrets in all seasons and all lights. Even in total darkness, I could navigate its paths and hidden places well enough to evade pursuit if necessary. The figure paused in their approach, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought they had spotted me. But then they changed direction, moving toward the forest entrance with deliberate steps. Their movement had a practiced quality to it, like someone who had done this many times before. The way they swept their flashlight in precise arcs suggested they were searching for something specific. I remained frozen behind the picnic shelter, barely daring to breathe. Minutes stretched like hours as I waited, straining my ears for any sound of return. Eventually, the forest swallowed both the figure and their light, leaving me alone with questions that would haunt me for months to come. After waiting what felt like an eternity, I carefully emerged from my hiding spot to scan for any sign of the mysterious figure. The park had fallen into an unnatural stillness, the kind that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. The earlier sound, that impossible moaning whisper, and the appearance of the strange hunter may or may not have been connected, but the timing seemed too precise to be mere coincidence. What I had witnessed defied easy explanation. Mountain lions, I understand. They're natural predators with predictable behaviors. But what I heard that night wasn't any big cat I've ever encountered. Mountain lions can scream, yes, but their vocalizations don't seem to bend the laws of spatial reality. They don't somehow manage to sound simultaneously distant and right beside you. The size of Riverside Park presents its own puzzle. At roughly a square mile, it's hardly the vast wilderness you'd expect to harbor legendary creatures. The forest portion is even smaller, yet somehow dense enough to swallow a person whole once they step off the maintained paths. But could it really sustain something like a skinwalker? The traditional lore suggests they need much more territory. However, Crestview Forest lies just 20 minutes away through the suburbs, a sprawling wilderness that could easily harbor all manner of unexplained things. Could something move between these two green spaces, using the corridors of suburban darkness as a highway? The thought of some ancient entity navigating modern development, slipping between streetlights and through backyard shadows, is almost more unsettling than encountering it in pure wilderness. The hunter's appearance raises even more questions. Their equipment and behavior suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had done this before. If they were hunting something supernatural, it implies a whole hidden world operating in parallel to our ordinary lives. People who track and perhaps confront things that most of us prefer to pretend don't exist. The most disturbing possibility is that they weren't hunting at all, but rather searching for someone like me. A solitary figure in a dark place. The kind of person who might disappear without anyone asking too many questions. Yet their behavior didn't feel predatory so much as purposeful, like someone following a very specific protocol. I still visit Riverside Park, but never after sunset now. During daylight hours, it's easy to dismiss that night's events as an overactive imagination, combined with poor visibility and natural sounds. But when the sun starts to sink, I can't help but remember the impossible sound by the fence, the methodical movement of that flashlight beam, the strange implements strapped to the hunter's limbs. Sometimes, walking past the playground during the day, I'll catch movement in my peripheral vision near that fence line. When I turn to look, there's never anything there, at least nothing I can see. But the bushes sometimes move against the wind, and occasionally I'll find unusual prints in the soft earth. Not quite human, not quite animal, and certainly not belonging to any creature I can name. I've started paying more attention to local news reports, noting any patterns in missing pet cases or unusual animal sightings. I've begun to notice how many stories end with probably just a mountain lion, as if we're all collectively agreeing to accept the most comfortable explanation rather than confront more disturbing possibilities. Was what I heard that night a skinwalker? Was the figure with the flashlight hunting it, studying it, or perhaps communing with it? I don't know if I'll ever have answers to these questions, but I do know that our city's wild places, these small forests we've allowed to remain, might serve purposes we don't fully understand. Perhaps they're not just relics of the natural world, but rather doorways to something older, something that watches and waits in the spaces between streetlights and civilization. The swing set still stands, of course, silhouetted against the darkening sky each evening. Sometimes I drive past after sunset and see others using it, totally unaware of what might be watching from just beyond the fence. I want to warn them, but what would I say? That I heard something impossible? That I saw someone who might have been hunting monsters? That our familiar park might be a way station for things that shouldn't exist? So I keep my silence, but I watch the local missing persons reports more carefully now. And when I hear people dismiss unusual sounds as just a mountain lion, I notice how quickly they change the subject, as if afraid that talking too much about what lurks in our urban forests might somehow draw its attention. Because maybe that's the real truth. Not that these places are too small to harbor mysteries, but that they're exactly the size they need to be. Just large enough to hide something ancient in plain sight. Just wild enough to maintain a foothold in our modern world, and just close enough to remind us that civilization's boundaries are more permeable than we'd like to believe. They call me River. The nickname's got its own story, but that's a tale for another time. What I'm about to share happened last summer in Pine Haven, a sleepy little town tucked away in the coastal forests of South Carolina. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the line between civilization and wilderness gets real blurry around the edges. My friends Marcus and Jade had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We'd grown up in Pine Haven together, spent countless summers exploring the woods that stretched out behind my family's property. The forest was our playground, our sanctuary, and we thought we knew every inch of it. We were wrong. The first day went exactly as planned. We hiked out to Walker's Pond, our usual spot about 2 miles into the woods. It was a beautiful clearing we'd been using since high school, perfect for camping, with good fishing nearby at Carpenter's Creek. We set up our tents, arranged the camo netting, more out of habit than necessity, and got a good fire going as the sun started to sink. That first evening felt like 100 others we'd spent out there. We sat around the fire, sharing stories and laughing about old times. The night was alive with the usual symphony of crickets and frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. Everything felt right with the world. The second day is when reality started to slip sideways. We woke up late, shared our morning ritual of coffee and cannabis, then decided to try our luck at Carpenter's Creek. The fish always bit better in the morning, and we were hoping to catch enough for a proper fish fry. The walk to the creek was about half a mile through dense forest, following a trail we'd worn down over years of use. That's when Marcus spotted the tracks. Now, I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I know every print, every sign an animal can leave. Down here, the white-tailed deer rarely get bigger than a large dog. It's just how they evolved in this environment. But these tracks, these were something else entirely. They were bipedal for one thing, 2 legs, like a person walking, but they were clearly deer tracks, just impossibly large. When I knelt down to examine them, the print was bigger than my spread hand. The depth of the impression suggested something of impossible weight, and they were heading straight toward our camp. We tried to laugh it off as we continued toward Carpenter's Creek, but there was an undercurrent of tension in our conversation. Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, and Jade, usually the most level-headed of us all, stayed unusually close to my side. The forest felt different somehow, darker despite the morning sun, more watchful. The creek, when we reached it, was running clear and cold. We settled into our usual spot, a worn patch of bank where generations of Pine Haven locals had cast their lines. For a while, everything felt normal again. The fishing was good. We pulled in 7 beautiful speckled trout within the first hour. The familiar rhythm of casting and reeling helped ease our nerves, and we started to convince ourselves we'd been spooked over nothing. That's when we heard the scream. If you've never heard a big cat scream, it can freeze your blood solid. But this was different. It started like a mountain lion's cry, but stretched on impossibly long. 15, maybe 20 seconds of sustained sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was distant enough that I tried to play it cool for Marcus and Jade's sake, explaining about the panthers that had been spotted in the area recently. Just a big cat marking territory, I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Mountain lions don't scream like that. We packed up our catch and headed back to camp, trying to maintain normal conversation, but all of us walking faster than necessary. The sun was high overhead now, but the forest canopy seemed to swallow the light, creating deep pools of shadow between the trees. When we reached the clearing, we all stopped dead in our tracks. Those same massive deer prints we'd seen earlier were everywhere, circling our tents in a deliberate pattern. But worse were the claw marks, 3 deep gouges in the earth outside my tent, each one wide as my wrist and deep enough to sink my fingers into. Could be someone messing with us, Marcus suggested, but his voice shook slightly. Maybe Dylan and his crew found out we were camping out here. We knew it wasn't Dylan or any other local playing pranks, but we clung to that explanation like a life raft. What was the alternative? Accepting that something impossible had visited our camp while we were gone. We rebuilt the fire and cooked up some of the trout, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. The day passed in a haze of forced casualness. We swam in the pond, took walks around the immediate area, never straying far from camp, shared a few more joints. We talked about everything except what we'd seen, like speaking about it might make it more real somehow. The conversation kept drifting toward nostalgia, memories of our childhood adventures in these woods, plans for the future, the kind of talk that happens when summer's ending and you can feel change coming. Looking back, it feels like we were unconsciously saying goodbye to something, not just to summer, but to the comfortable certainty of a world we thought we understood. Night fell too quickly. We built the fire up big, none of us wanting to be first to suggest turning in. The woods had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like nature holding its breath. When we finally crawled into our tents, sleep came in fitful bursts, each of us listening for something we hoped not to hear. The scream came just after midnight. It ripped through the darkness like a physical force, so close it seemed to vibrate in my bones. I grabbed my Remington 870, never go camping in these woods without protection, and burst out of my tent. Marcus and Jade were already outside, their faces ghostly in the dying firelight. "Tell me that wasn't what I think it was," Jade whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't answer, just threw more logs on the fire. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the darkness but somehow making the shadows beyond our circle of light seem deeper, more alive. That's when we noticed the silence. In these woods, silence is never really silent. There's always something: crickets chirping, frogs calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But now there was nothing. The forest had gone dead quiet, like someone had hit a universal mute button. The only sound was our own breathing and the soft crack of burning wood. Then we heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, the sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth. Whatever it was circling our camp, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We stood back to back, straining our eyes against the darkness. The thing that stepped into the light defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I'm not a small man, 6'4" in my boots, but this creature made me feel like a child. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was vaguely humanoid but wrong somehow, too thin and too long, covered in what looked like white fur that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. But it was the head that turned my blood to ice. Where a head should have been, there was a massive deer skull, bleached white and somehow ancient-looking. The eye sockets were completely black, but there was no doubt it could see us. The antlers stretched toward the sky like reaching fingers, casting spiderweb shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Training took over, and I fired 3 slugs directly into its chest. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the clearing, but the creature barely flinched. It just stood there, those empty eye sockets fixed on me. And then, God help me, it smiled. The deer skull actually smiled, the bone somehow shifting in ways bone should never move. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "get the keys from my tent, slow and easy." The creature's head snapped toward Jade when Marcus moved, and I took the opportunity to fire again, the slug catching it square in the abdomen. The impact should have torn it in half, but it just turned that impossible smile back toward me. I heard the blessed sound of my old Ford Bronco starting up behind us. "Jade," I said softly, "when I count to 3, run for the car. Don't look back." We made it to the Bronco somehow, though those seconds felt like hours. Marcus had it in gear before we'd even closed the doors, and we went tearing down the old logging road like the devil himself was chasing us, which, for all I know, might not have been far from the truth. We were flying down that old logging road at speeds that should have torn the Bronco's suspension to pieces. The headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, branches whipping past like grasping hands. Marcus was driving like a man possessed, and I was about to tell him to ease up before he got us all killed when Jade's scream split the night. The impact hit us like a sledgehammer. The whole vehicle lurched sideways, metal screaming in protest. In the rearview mirror, illuminated by our brake lights, I saw it. That bone-white figure running on 2 legs, keeping pace with a vehicle doing over 60 miles per hour. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like watching a deer's legs attached to a human body, all angles and joints moving in ways that violated every law of nature. "Don't stop!" I shouted, though Marcus showed no signs of slowing down. "Just get us to the main road." The creature matched our speed, stride for stride. Each time its feet hit the ground, the whole Bronco shuddered like we were being hit with invisible waves of force. That deer skull face was level with our windows now, those black eye sockets seeming to stare directly into my soul. The smile was still there, stretched impossibly wide across bone that should have been rigid. Marcus did something then that I still can't explain. Some combination of instinct and desperation that made him wrench the wheel at just the right moment, somehow finding an extra burst of speed on that treacherous dirt road. The engine roared in protest, but the Bronco responded, pulling ahead inch by agonizing inch. When we finally hit the asphalt of Mountain Creek Road, the sudden absence of pursuit was almost as shocking as the creature's appearance had been. One moment it was there, keeping pace with impossible ease, and the next it was just gone. Like it had hit some invisible boundary it couldn't or wouldn't cross. We didn't stop driving until we reached my house, and none of us spoke a word the whole way. The first light of dawn was just starting to creep over the horizon when we pulled into my driveway, the normal world seeming somehow fake after what we'd experienced. That was last summer, and none of us have been camping since. Our gear is still out there, abandoned in that clearing by Walker's Pond. Sometimes I think about going back for it in broad daylight, but something stops me every time. It's not just fear. It's the certainty that the thing we encountered that night is still there, waiting. The physical evidence remains, though we've kept quiet about it until now. There are 3 distinct claw marks down the side of my Bronco, deep gouges in the metal that no local body shop can quite explain. The back tires, which were nearly new, show strange wear patterns that my mechanic says shouldn't be possible based on any normal use. We've done research since then, careful and quiet, looking into local legends and similar encounters. Pine Haven has its share of strange stories. Most small southern towns do. But nothing quite matches what we saw. The closest we've found are old Cherokee legends about skinwalkers, and even older tales about things that live in the deep woods, things that wear the faces of animals but walk like men. Marcus moved to Charleston not long after, though he says it's for work. Jade still lives in town but won't set foot in the woods anymore. Me? I've started locking my doors at night, something I never used to do in Pine Haven. And when the moon is full and I hear something moving in the woods behind my house, I try very hard not to look out the windows. I'm sharing this story now because I've been hearing rumors. Whispered conversations at the local diner, odd reports from hunters, stories of strange tracks and livestock acting nervous. Something is stirring in the woods around Pine Haven, and people need to know what's out there. Whatever that creature was, Wendigo, skinwalker, or something else entirely, it challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The 4 shots I put into it should have dropped a grizzly bear, but it didn't even bleed. No natural animal can keep pace with a vehicle at highway speeds, and nothing made of bone should be able to smile like that. The forest feels different now, like something fundamental has changed. The familiar woods of my childhood have become alien territory, and every shadow holds the possibility of that white shape, that bone smile. I still hunt, still fish, but never alone and never after dark. And I never ever look too closely at deer skulls anymore. To anyone reading this who might be thinking about camping in the Pine Haven area, don't. Or if you must, stick to the established campgrounds, the places where the light pollution from town can still reach you. There are things in the deep woods that defy explanation, things that wear familiar shapes but aren't familiar at all. And if you're ever out there and the woods go quiet, if you hear a scream that goes on too long or see tracks that look almost like deer prints but not quite, don't try to be brave. Don't try to understand. Just run. Run as fast as you can towards civilization and pray that whatever's out there decides not to follow. Because sometimes the things we think we know about our world are just comfortable lies we tell ourselves. Sometimes the real truth is wearing a deer skull face and smiling at us from the darkness, waiting for us to venture just a little too far from the safety of our artificial lights and rational explanations. The forests of Oregon had always been my sanctuary. Growing up in a small logging town nestled against the Cascade Range, I learned early that the woods could be both provider and teacher. My grandfather, who spent 40 years working these forests, taught my father the ways of tracking and hunting. My father, in turn, passed those lessons on to me. By the time I was 12, I could read tracks better than most adults, understanding the subtle language written in broken twigs and displaced leaves. Now at 34, with 15 years of solo hunting under my belt, I thought I knew every secret these woods held. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The morning of October 12, 2023, started like any other hunting day. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct autumn bite that makes your lungs feel clean and sharp. I parked my '98 Ford pickup at my usual spot, a small clearing about 8 miles up Forest Service Road 217. The spot was far enough from the main highway to keep away the weekend warriors, but close enough to civilization that I could usually get a cell signal if needed. Dawn was just beginning to filter through the canopy as I grabbed my Remington 700 from its case. The familiar weight of the rifle brought comfort as I performed my standard safety checks: action clear, scope caps off, ammunition secured. I'd added a few modifications over the years: a custom stock for better fit, a Leupold scope that cost more than my first car, and a specialized trigger that broke like glass. Some might call it overkill for deer hunting, but I believed in being prepared. The weather report had promised clear skies, but a heavy mist hung in the valleys, creating ghostly shapes among the Douglas firs and western red cedars. The moisture would make tracking easier, though. Rain from the previous night had left the ground soft, perfect for reading sign. My usual route took me northeast from the clearing, following an old game trail that wound through stands of second-growth timber. The forest here was thick but manageable, with enough understory to support deer, but not so dense as to make stalking impossible. I'd been watching a particular buck for the past week, a heavy-bodied four-point that had established a predictable pattern between bedding and feeding areas. The first hour passed in comfortable solitude. The forest was alive with morning sounds: western tanagers calling from the canopy, the soft scrabbling of Douglas squirrels, the distant hammering of a pileated woodpecker. These were the sounds of a healthy forest, the background music to countless hunting trips. Around 9:30, I reached the small meadow where I'd last seen signs of the buck. The grass was still wet with dew, and clear tracks showed in the soft earth, the distinctive heart-shaped prints of a large deer, probably made within the last few hours. I knelt to examine them more closely, noting the direction and depth. The buck had been moving slowly, probably feeding. That's when I noticed the other tracks. At first I thought I was looking at bear sign. We had plenty of black bears in these woods, and while they generally avoided humans, it wasn't unusual to find their tracks. But something about these prints was wrong. They were too large for a black bear, too elongated. The stride length was impossible, easily 7 feet between prints, and they were fresh, overlapping the deer tracks in places. I've spent enough time in these woods to know every animal that calls them home. These tracks belonged to nothing I'd ever encountered. The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone playing a prank, maybe some kind of deformity in a known species. But 20 years of experience told me I was looking at something else entirely. Logic told me to turn back, to forget what I was seeing and return to my truck. But curiosity, that damned human need to know, pushed me forward. I followed the strange tracks, my boots silent on the damp forest floor. The traditional tracking techniques my grandfather taught me seemed almost absurd now. These weren't deer tracks I was following, weren't even bear tracks. They were something else entirely. The forest grew denser as I moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The towering Douglas firs gave way to older growth, ancient western red cedars whose trunks were wider than my truck. The understory thinned out, creating an almost cathedral-like space beneath the canopy. Moss hung in thick curtains from the branches, and the morning mist still clung to the ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. About a mile in, the habitat changed dramatically. The healthy forest floor suddenly gave way to bare earth, as if nothing could grow there. The air grew thick with a sickly sweet odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet soil. My training told me this was wrong. Predator dens don't smell like this. Even bear caves have a different scent. The clearing appeared suddenly, a roughly circular space about 50 yards across. At first I thought I was looking at a garbage dump. White objects scattered across the ground, partially buried in leaves and soil. Then I saw the skull. It was unmistakably human, though weathered and stained by exposure. Next to it lay a femur, its end showing clear signs of being crushed by powerful jaws. More bones were scattered throughout the clearing. Some human, some animal, some so damaged I couldn't identify them. I'd seen enough deer carcasses to know what animal kills look like. These weren't clean kills. They were savage, brutal. My hand tightened on my rifle as I cataloged the scene with a detachment of shock. A torn backpack, at least a few years old, lay half buried near a fallen log. A boot, still containing foot bones, rested against a tree trunk. The sight felt old, established, like this had been happening for years without anyone knowing. The sound came without warning, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear's growl, wasn't a cougar's scream. It was something primal, something that spoke to the ancient part of our brains that remembers being prey. I turned slowly, my movements careful and deliberate. The rifle felt pathetically inadequate as I raised it to my shoulder. What emerged from the shadows defied explanation. It moved like a predator but stood upright like a man. Easily 8 feet tall, its body was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the face that haunts me still, a twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with a protruding jaw full of yellowed fangs and eyes that held intelligence. Terrible, calculating intelligence. My first shot was pure instinct. The .30, 06 round caught it in the shoulder, the impact throwing it back a step. But it didn't fall. Dear God, it didn't even seem seriously hurt. The creature's roar of pain and rage shook leaves from the trees. I ran. Everything I knew about wilderness survival, about standing your ground against predators, went out the window. I ran like our ancestors must have run from the terrors in the dark, driven by pure primal fear. The forest that had been my second home became an obstacle course of roots and branches that tore at my clothes and skin. I could hear it behind me, not just following but hurting me, crashing through the undergrowth to my left and right, forcing me down certain paths. By some miracle, I broke through to the logging road about a quarter mile from my truck. The gravel crunched under my boots as I sprinted, lungs burning, legs trembling. I reached the truck and fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. The engine roared to life and I threw the truck into reverse, tires spraying gravel. As I turned onto the main road, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. A dark shape at the forest's edge, watching. Just watching. The sheriff's office in town is a small building, probably dating back to the 1950s. Sheriff Warren Hudson had known my father, had even been on hunting trips with us when I was younger. When I burst into his office, covered in scratches and wild-eyed, he listened without interruption. "Show me," was all he said when I finished. We assembled a search team. Hudson, 2 deputies, a state wildlife officer, and me. The drive back felt surreal, like we were heading to disprove a child's nightmare. But the clearing was there, exactly as I'd left it. The bones, the backpack, everything. Everything except the creature. The investigation that followed opened old wounds in the community. Records showed dozens of missing persons cases in these woods over the past 50 years. Hikers, campers, even a few hunters. Most had been written off as accidents or runaway cases. The bones we found told a different story. DNA testing identified 3 of the victims: a hiker from Seattle who disappeared in 2019, a local teenager who vanished in 2021, and a Forest Service worker who went missing in 2018. The other remains were too degraded for identification, but the count suggested at least 12 individuals. The official report cited an unknown predator species as the cause of death. Search teams combed the area for weeks. They found other sites, other clearings with more remains, but they never found the creature. The national media descended on our town briefly, drawing the usual mix of cryptozoologists, conspiracy theorists, and thrill seekers. But eventually they moved on to other stories. The Forest Service posted new warning signs. Life, as it tends to do, went back to normal. Except it wasn't normal, not for me. I sold my hunting gear the following spring. The rifle, the camping equipment, all of it. Some nights I wake up hearing that growl, feeling those eyes watching me. I've talked to therapists trying to rationalize what I saw. They suggest trauma, hallucination, the mind playing tricks in a moment of stress. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. The forest isn't just a place of trees and animals. It's a reminder that the world is older and stranger than we like to admit. We've built our civilizations and told ourselves we're at the top of the food chain. But sometimes in the deep woods where the shadows grow thick, something moves that remembers when we weren't. I still live here in this town on the edge of the forest. Sometimes on dark nights when the wind blows from the mountains, I think I hear that growl again. The locals don't talk about it much anymore, but they've changed their habits. No one hikes alone now. No one stays in the woods after dark. The clearing has grown over. Nature reclaims everything eventually. But if you know where to look, if you have the courage to venture that deep into the woods, you might find fragments of bone gleaming white among the leaves. And if you're very unlucky, you might hear a sound that doesn't belong in our modern world, a sound that speaks of hunger and darkness and things that should not exist. But I don't go looking. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. Some parts of the forest should stay wild and unknown. I've made my peace with that. Yet sometimes, when I look toward the mountains, I wonder about that creature. Was it a survivor from some prehistoric age? A twisted experiment gone wrong? Or something else entirely? Something that has always been there, hunting in the shadows while we tell ourselves we've tamed the wilderness? I keep a loaded rifle by my bed now, not because I think it would help. I know better than that. But it's a comfort, like a child's nightlight pushing back the darkness. And every time I hear about another disappearance in those woods, I close my curtains and try not to think about what's really out there. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them have teeth. It's funny how the smallest things can lead to the biggest messes. Take my hunting trip in the Rockies back in October 2023, for instance. I'd just turned 35, and my life had become an endless cycle of Zoom meetings and deadline pressures at the architecture firm where I worked. I'm Lionel Stover, and until that weekend, my idea of roughing it meant dealing with slow Wi-Fi at a hotel. My friend Hugh Chen had been trying to get me out of the city for months. "You're burning out, man," he'd say during our weekly beer nights, concern evident in his eyes. Hugh was different from my other friends, an environmental scientist who spent more time tracking wildlife populations than attending happy hours. We'd been friends since college, when we were randomly assigned as roommates. He'd tried to get me interested in outdoor activities for years, but I'd always found an excuse to stay in my comfort zone. But that autumn, something in me finally snapped. Maybe it was the third consecutive weekend I spent working, or the growing feeling that my life was slipping by in a blur of spreadsheets and client meetings. When Hugh mentioned his upcoming hunting trip, instead of my usual polite refusal, I heard myself saying yes. "You're serious?" Hugh had asked, clearly surprised. "You know this isn't glamping, right? We're talking real wilderness." I nodded, already feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. I need this. I need to disconnect, to do something completely different. Hugh spent the next 2 weeks preparing me. He took me to a shooting range to practice with his spare rifle, a Remington 700, that felt alien in my hands at first. We went shopping for proper gear: thermal underwear, waterproof boots, a heavy-duty jacket. He made me learn to read a topographical map and use a compass, insisting we couldn't rely solely on GPS in the backcountry. "Technology fails," he'd said, tapping the compass. "This doesn't." The morning of our departure, I woke at 4 a.m., my apartment still dark and quiet. I triple-checked my pack, paranoid about forgetting something essential. Hugh picked me up in his weathered Toyota Tacoma, the bed loaded with our gear. As we drove out of Denver, the city lights faded behind us, replaced by the imposing silhouettes of the Rockies. The drive took us through winding mountain roads, the truck's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Hugh filled the time with hunting stories and safety instructions, but I was only half listening, mesmerized by the landscape slowly revealing itself as dawn broke. The mountains were different from this close, more imposing, more real than they appeared from my downtown apartment. We parked at a remote trailhead around 7 a.m. The temperature was just above freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs as we shouldered our packs. The weight was immediate and uncomfortable, about 40 pounds of gear that Hugh insisted was all essential. "Remember," Hugh said as we started hiking, "we're guests here. This isn't our territory." He gestured to the dense forest ahead of us. "Everything out here has evolved to survive in these conditions. We're the outsiders." The first hour of hiking was brutal. Though I'd been hitting the gym regularly, nothing had prepared me for the combination of altitude, weight, and terrain. The path, if you could call it that, wound through dense pine forest, climbing steadily. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid roots, rocks, and sudden drops. Hugh moved with practiced ease despite carrying a heavier pack. He would stop occasionally, pointing out signs I would have missed: scattered pine needles indicating a squirrel's meal, bark stripped from a tree by an elk, the distinctive scat of a black bear. "Learning to read the forest is like learning a new language," he explained. "Everything out here is constantly communicating. You just have to learn how to listen." By mid-morning, we'd covered about 4 miles and gained nearly 2,000 feet in elevation. Hugh led us to what he called our base camp, a small clearing nestled between 2 ridges. As we set up our tents, he explained his strategy. "There's a natural funnel about half a mile north of here," he said, pointing to his topographical map. "The deer use it to move between grazing areas. We can split up, cover both ends. Better chances that way." I must have looked uncertain because he quickly added, "We'll stay in radio contact, maximum half a mile apart. This isn't my first rodeo, Lionel." We ate a quick lunch of trail mix and beef jerky. Then Hugh gave me a final briefing. He drew out our positions on the map, made sure I understood how to use the radio, and ran through emergency procedures one last time. As he spoke, clouds began rolling in, darkening the forest around us. "Weather's changing," Hugh noted, glancing at the sky. "Might work in our favor. Deer move more when a storm's coming." As we split up, the forest felt different. Alone, every sound took on new significance. I kept my hand near the radio on my belt, reassured by Hugh's occasional check-ins. The clouds continued gathering, turning the afternoon twilight dim. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a light drizzle began to fall. I followed the route Hugh had marked for me, moving as quietly as I could manage. Every snapped twig under my boots made me wince. The rain intensified gradually, creating a constant background patter on the pine needles above. The moisture brought out the sharp scent of decomposing vegetation and wet earth. After about 40 minutes, I found a promising spot, a fallen Douglas fir creating a natural blind overlooking a small drainage. I settled in, rifle across my lap, trying to remember everything Hugh had taught me about staying still and patient. The rain continued steadily, soaking into my jacket despite its waterproofing. The first hour passed slowly. I fought the urge to check my phone, remembering there was no service anyway. My legs began to cramp from sitting still, but I refused to move, determined to prove I could handle this. The forest's sounds had become almost hypnotic. Rain, creaking branches, distant bird calls. Then everything changed. The birds went silent first. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice immediately, but when I did, the silence felt wrong. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, making the stillness more apparent. A heavy feeling settled over the clearing, like the air before a thunderstorm. Movement caught my eye, something dark shifting between trees about 60 yards away. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain still, just as Hugh had taught me. The shape moved again, more deliberately this time. It was large, but moved with an unnatural fluidity that immediately ruled out deer or elk. I reached slowly for my radio, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. Before I could grab it, a sound cut through the forest. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh, but something hideously between the two. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands shook as I raised the rifle, scanning the trees through the scope. The rain had picked up again, limiting visibility. Something flickered at the edge of my vision and I swung the rifle toward it. Nothing, just shadows and swaying branches. The radio crackled. "Lionel?" Hugh's voice was barely audible through the static. "Everything okay? Thought I heard something." Before I could respond, movement exploded from the underbrush to my right. I caught a glimpse of something impossible. Limbs too long, joints bent wrong, patches of fur or hair plastered to grayish skin. The creature moved with terrible speed, covering the distance between us in seconds. I fired. The shot went wide, the report deafening in the enclosed space. The creature didn't even flinch. It hit me with devastating force, knocking the rifle from my hands and sending me sprawling. Pain exploded across my chest as claws raked through my jacket and into flesh. The thing's face was inches from mine, a twisted parody of something almost human. Its eyes held an intelligence that terrified me more than its strength. They were predator's eyes, but there was something else there. Something that suggested it understood exactly what it was doing. I fought back purely on instinct, my hand finding the hunting knife on my belt. The blade sank into tough, leathery flesh. The creature's shriek was like metal grinding on metal. It recoiled, giving me a chance to scramble away. Blood, both mine and its, mixed with the rain on the forest floor. I could hear Hugh shouting through the radio, but couldn't make out the words. The creature circled me, moving with that same fluid wrongness. I found my rifle in the mud and brought it up just as it lunged again. This time my shot found its mark. The impact threw the creature backward, dark blood spraying from its chest. It disappeared into the forest with impossible speed, leaving only broken branches and bloodstains as evidence of its existence. I slumped against a tree, pressing my hand against the wounds on my chest. The pain was intense but somehow distant, shock already setting in. Hugh found me 10 minutes later, alerted by the gunshots. He took one look at my injuries and switched immediately into crisis mode. Later, he told me he'd heard the creature's calls too, had been moving in my direction even before the shots. The hike back to the truck was a nightmare of pain and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. Hugh half carried me the last mile, my blood soaking through the makeshift bandages he'd applied. The nearest hospital was in Granby, an hour's drive away. In the emergency room, the doctors struggled to classify my injuries. "Not consistent with known wildlife," one of them muttered. The claw marks were too wide, too deep, and showed signs of what they called unusual tissue trauma. They gave me strong antibiotics and dozens of stitches. The official report listed it as a bear attack. Hugh backed up this story, though I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. We both knew what we'd heard, what we'd seen, wasn't any known predator. Recovery took weeks. The physical wounds healed faster than the psychological ones. I couldn't sleep without lights on. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I began researching obsessively, looking for similar incidents in the area. I found things: old newspaper articles about disappearances, forum posts describing encounters with something in those mountains, Native American legends about creatures that walked between human and beast. Nothing matched exactly what I'd seen, but there were enough similarities to keep me searching. Hugh visited regularly during my recovery, bringing food and keeping me company. He never questioned my account of what happened, never suggested I might have imagined or misinterpreted things. Instead, he listened and offered his own observations from years in those mountains. "There are things out there we don't understand," he said one evening. "Things that prefer to stay hidden. Maybe you saw something that didn't want to be seen." 6 months later, I'm back at work, back to my normal routine. The scars have faded to silvery lines across my chest. I've started hiking again, though never alone and never in that part of the Rockies. The doctors say I've made a full recovery, but I'm changed. I notice things now, the way shadows move when no one's watching, the sudden silences that fall in wild places. I keep my research notes, adding to them whenever I find new information. Hugh and I still talk about that day, though less frequently now. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those eyes, that terrible intelligence behind them. I wonder if it's still out there, if it remembers me as I remember it. I wonder how many others have encountered it and stayed silent, afraid of not being believed. I know one thing for certain. There are spaces in this world where humanity's dominion is an illusion, places where we are not the apex predator, where our technology and civilization mean nothing. The wilderness holds secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth and claws. I still hear that sound sometimes in my dreams, that horrible combination of growl and laughter. When I do, I wake up sweating, my scars aching with phantom pain, and I wonder if somewhere in the dark spaces between the trees, that creature is laughing still. It was a warm summer evening in 2017 when I found myself driving through the winding roads of rural Virginia. My car, a weathered 2003 Toyota Camry that had become my home in recent months, rumbled along the cracked pavement as I searched for a place to rest for the night. The dashboard clock read 7:42 p.m., and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the countryside and painting the sky in rich hues of orange and pink. The air conditioning struggled against the lingering heat, and the radio signal had long since dissolved into static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. The circumstances that had led me to this nomadic existence were complicated, a combination of a career setback, a painful divorce, and a desire to simply drive away from it all. I'd been on the road for 3 months, picking up odd jobs when I needed money, sleeping in campgrounds or rest stops, and trying to piece together what the next chapter of my life might look like. The solitude had become both a comfort and a burden, teaching me things about myself I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As I navigated the unfamiliar terrain, my headlights caught a wooden sign indicating a campground ahead, Pine Grove Recreational Area, The carved letters were weathered but still legible, and an arrow pointed down a narrow gravel road that disappeared into a thick stand of oak and pine trees. Feeling the weight of exhaustion from hours of driving, I decided to pull in and find a spot to settle for the night. The campground was more expansive than I'd expected, with numerous clearings nestled among the trees. To my relief, it appeared mostly empty, save for a large group gathered in a distant corner of the grounds, their vehicles, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs, parked in a rough semicircle around what appeared to be a communal area. I chose a spot far from the group, hoping for a quiet night's rest. The clearing I selected was bordered by two massive oak trees, their branches creating a natural canopy overhead. As I began to set up my modest camp, really just a hammock strung between the trees and a small tarp for protection against unexpected rain, I couldn't help but notice the boisterous sounds emanating from the other campers. Their laughter and chatter carried on the evening breeze, punctuated occasionally by the barking of dogs and the distinctive sound of beer cans being opened. The ritual of setting up camp had become second nature to me over the past months. I unpacked my small cooler with its meager supplies and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers, supplemented with an apple that was slightly past its prime. As I ate perched on a fallen log I'd dragged near my hammock, I watched the sky darken and stars begin to twinkle overhead. The air grew cooler, and I pulled on a worn University of Michigan sweatshirt to ward off the chill. The fabric still carried the faint scent of my former life, laundry detergent from a house I no longer lived in, memories of a marriage that had crumbled beneath the weight of unspoken words and growing distance. Throughout the evening, several dogs from the other group wandered over to investigate my campsite. They were an odd mix, a couple of German shepherds, a Rottweiler, and what looked like a pit bull mix. They seemed friendly enough, sniffing around curiously before returning to their owners. I found their presence somewhat comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this unfamiliar place, though something about their well-trained, almost militant behavior struck me as unusual for typical camping dogs. As night fully settled in, I retreated to my hammock, looking forward to a peaceful sleep beneath the canopy of trees. The sounds from the other group had quieted somewhat, though there was an undercurrent of tension in their hushed conversations that carried across the darkness. I lay there, gently swaying in the breeze, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had begun to settle over me like a heavy blanket. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a commotion from across the campground jolted me awake. Voices rose in volume, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Car doors slammed and flashlight beams began to dance through the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat up in my hammock, straining my eyes to see what was happening in the distance. The moon had risen, casting a pale light that created more shadows than illumination. What I witnessed next sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. In the dim light of the camp, I could make out the silhouette of a woman leading a small child, probably no more than 6 or 7 years old, towards a large wooden structure that I hadn't noticed being assembled in the darkness. As they drew closer to the structure, I realized with growing horror that it was a cross, standing at least 15 feet tall against the night sky, its rough-hewn surface pale in the moonlight. My heart began to race as I watched the woman gently guide the child's hand, helping them light what appeared to be a torch. The flames caught quickly, and within moments the cross was ablaze, casting an eerie glow across the campground and illuminating the faces of those gathered around. It was then that the true nature of this group became horrifyingly clear. What I had mistaken for a family camping gathering was actually a Klan meeting. The burning cross stood as a symbol of hatred and intolerance, a rallying point for the Ku Klux Klan members who had gathered here in secret. As the fire grew, so did the fervor of the group. What had earlier been casual conversations transformed into something far more sinister. Voices rose in a cacophony of hatred, shouting slogans and chants that made my blood run cold. The white robes and hoods that some members now wore seemed to glow in the firelight, creating ghostly silhouettes that would haunt my dreams for years to come. "White power!" they cried, their voices filled with a misguided passion that made me physically recoil in my hammock. The speeches that followed were like something from a historical documentary, but happening here and now, in real time. A tall man in civilian clothes, likely their leader, stepped forward into the firelight. His voice carried across the campground with practiced authority, his words a toxic mixture of conspiracy theories and racial grievances that he delivered with the cadence of a preacher. I found myself holding my breath, torn between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing fear of drawing attention to myself by moving. My car was parked on the other side of the clearing. Getting to it would mean potentially being seen. The ceremonial atmosphere of the gathering suggested this wasn't a spontaneous event, but rather a carefully planned meeting. My mind raced with questions about whether they had lookouts posted, whether they had noticed my arrival earlier, whether my Michigan license plate had already marked me as an outsider. The children present, and there were several, not just the one who had helped light the cross, were dressed in what appeared to be scout-like uniforms. They stood in formation, backs straight, eyes forward, absorbing every word of hatred as if it were Sunday school scripture. One little girl, her blonde hair and pigtails, clutched a doll while her mother adjusted her collar with the same care any parent might show before a school photo. The normalcy of that maternal gesture, set against the backdrop of such hatred, made my stomach turn. A new speaker took the makeshift podium they had erected, this time a woman wearing a business suit rather than robes. Her presence suggested a calculating attempt at legitimacy, as if her professional appearance could somehow sanitize the poison she spewed. She spoke of preserving heritage and protecting our children's future, wrapping virulent racism in the language of family values and tradition. What struck me most was how ordinary these people appeared when they weren't in their robes. They could have been teachers, accountants, your neighbors. The night air had grown thick with wood smoke and tension. More crosses were lit, smaller ones arranged in a pattern around the central blaze. The fires cast jumping shadows through the trees, creating nightmarish shapes that seemed to dance between the trunks. The German shepherds that had seemed so friendly earlier now paced the perimeter of the gathering, their training evident in their alert postures and focused gazes. Hours passed like this, with speakers rotating and rituals being performed that seemed to be a twisted parody of religious ceremonies. They sang hymns, actual Christian hymns, interspersed with what I assumed were songs specific to their organization. The contradiction was jarring. The same melodies that might comfort a congregation on Sunday morning were here being used to celebrate hatred. Around midnight, the ceremony shifted. The children were led away by a few of the women, presumably to sleep in the RVs and tents scattered around the edges of their campsite. The speeches became more specific, more tactical. They discussed recruitment strategies, planned gatherings, and ways to identify potential allies in local government. The business-like tone of these conversations was perhaps more chilling than the earlier displays of overt racism. This wasn't just theater, it was strategic planning. I must have eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, my exhaustion finally overwhelming my fear. My dreams were a confused jumble of burning crosses, children's faces, and dark roads leading nowhere. I woke frequently, each time tensing at the sound of branches cracking under unseen feet or distant conversations I couldn't quite make out. Dawn broke with an almost insulting beauty, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. The morning light revealed the remnants of the previous night's activities: charred wood scattered across the clearing, empty beer cans and tire tracks carved deep into the soft ground. Most of the group appeared to be sleeping, though I could see a few early risers starting campfires for breakfast. going about their morning routines as if they hadn't spent the night participating in a ritual of hatred. I packed up my campsite with trembling hands, trying to be as quiet as possible while moving as quickly as I could. Every sound seemed magnified in the morning stillness: the zip of my bag, the crunch of leaves under my feet, the creak of my car door. The drive out of the campground was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I half expected to be stopped, questioned, or worse, but no one paid any attention to my departure. Once I hit the main road, I drove for hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Pine Grove. The events of the night played on an endless loop in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that first child lighting the cross, the careful way their small hand had been guided to participate in such a significant act of hate. It was an initiation, I realized, not just into an organization, but into a worldview that would shape their entire life. That experience in rural Virginia became a watershed moment in my life. The comfortable fiction that racism was a relic of the past, something confined to history books and grainy photographs, had been shattered. I had witnessed its modern face, not just angry people shouting slurs, but organized, educated individuals methodically passing their hatred down to a new generation. In the years that followed, I found my way back to a more settled life. The divorce that had sent me on my cross-country journey eventually became just another chapter in my past. I found a new job, bought a small house, started rebuilding. But I never forgot that night at Pine Grove. The memory of it drove me to become more involved in civil rights organizations, to speak up against casual racism when I encountered it, to donate to educational programs promoting diversity and inclusion. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about those children. They'd be teenagers now, or close to it. I wonder if any of them managed to break free from the ideology they were born into, if they found their way to a broader view of humanity. I wonder if that little girl with the doll still has her childhood innocence, or if it's been fully replaced by the hatred she was taught to embrace. What I witnessed that night was more than just a racist gathering. It was a glimpse into the machinery of how hatred perpetuates itself, how it's carefully packaged and passed down through generations. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the burning crosses or the chants. It was the mundane, almost bureaucratic nature of how they organized their bigotry, how they normalized it for their children, how they wrapped it in the familiar trappings of community and tradition. This story doesn't have a dramatic ending, no confrontations, no heroic stands against evil, just a quiet witness to darkness and the lingering responsibility that comes with such knowledge. In sharing this experience, I hope to shed light on the ongoing presence of organized hatred in our midst, and the urgent need to remain vigilant against its spread. The battle against racism isn't fought only in grand gestures and public protests. It's fought in small moments of courage, in speaking up, in teaching children a better way. The road out of Pine Grove led me not just away from that place, but toward a deeper understanding of my own role in the world. We can't change what we refuse to acknowledge, and having seen what I saw, silence was no longer an option. The weight of that night stays with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the work still to be done, the conversations still to be had, and the hope that future generations might know a world where such gatherings are truly just artifacts of a distant past. The night air was crisp and silent as I sat on my porch, the glow of my phone illuminating my face. I was video chatting with my old friend Alex, reminiscing about our high school days when he suddenly brought up a memory that sent chills down my spine. "Hey, Ethan," Alex said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Do you remember that time we went into Blackwater Forest, the one behind my old man's property?" My breath caught in my throat as fragments of a long-suppressed memory began to surface. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity before I managed to respond. That's not something I like to think about, Alex, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Alex's face on the screen grew serious. I know, man, but I've been thinking, maybe we should go back. Face our fears, you know? I laughed nervously, attempting to dispel the tension. Are you insane? After what we saw? Come on, Ethan, Alex pressed. We were just kids then. Maybe it wasn't as bad as we remember. Plus, we'd be prepared this time. I hesitated, memories of that terrifying night flooding back. The creature's eyes, its inhuman scream. But there was also a part of me that yearned for closure, to prove to myself that it had all been a figment of our overactive teenage imaginations. Fine, I said finally, but we're not going alone. Let's get the old gang back together. You, me, Marcus, and Olivia. Alex's face lit up with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I'll make the calls. We'll meet at my place in 2 days. And Ethan, come prepared. As I ended the call, a sense of foreboding settled over me. What had I just agreed to? 2 days later, I found myself in the back of Marcus's massive pickup truck, sandwiched between Olivia and a small arsenal of weapons and supplies. The familiar landscape of our hometown gave way to dense forest as we made our way to Alex's family property. The car ride was mostly silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts and memories of that fateful night years ago. Olivia was the first to break the silence. Are we insane for doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, spoke up from the driver's seat. We're prepared this time. Whatever's out there, we can handle it. I wasn't so sure, but I kept my doubts to myself. As we pulled up to Alex's house, I saw him standing on the porch, a grim expression on his face. He greeted us with forced cheerfulness, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Welcome back to hell, he said, attempting a joke that fell flat. We spent the next hour going over our plan and checking our gear. Each of us carried a backpack filled with supplies, food, water, first aid kits, and extra ammunition. We had an assortment of weapons, 2.22 caliber pistols, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a massive 4-gauge that looked like it could take down an elephant. As the sun began to set, we gathered at the edge of the property, staring into the depths of Blackwater Forest. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Last chance to back out, Alex said, his hand hovering over the latch of the gate that separated his property from the forest. We all exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between us. With a deep breath, Alex opened the gate, and we stepped into the darkness of the forest. The first hour of our trek was uneventful. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the brush. But as we ventured deeper, an unnatural silence began to settle over the woods. It started with the birds, their calls becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. Then the insects fell silent, their incessant chirping giving way to an eerie quiet. Just like last time, Olivia whispered, her voice tight with fear. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. It was Marcus who first noticed the footprints, large, misshapen impressions in the soft earth that were definitely not human. Guys, he called out, his voice trembling slightly. You need to see this. We gathered around, our flashlights illuminating the disturbing evidence of something large and unnatural moving through the forest. It's real, Alex breathed. It's still here. As if in response to his words, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the trees, causing us all to flinch. It was a sound that defied description, part animal, part something else entirely. We need to move, I said, gripping my weapon tightly. Now. We picked up our pace, no longer caring about stealth. The creature's cry had awoken something primal within us, the instinct to flee, to survive. But as we rushed through the darkened forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the hunters anymore. We were the prey. The attack came without warning. One moment we were moving through the forest, and the next, chaos erupted around us. A massive shape burst from the undergrowth, all teeth and claws and glowing yellow eyes. "Fire!" Alex screamed, and we unleashed a barrage of bullets and buckshot. The creature, for lack of a better word, seemed to shrug off our initial assault. It was just as terrifying as I remembered from our teenage encounter, if not more so. Standing at least 8 feet tall, its body was a nightmarish fusion of human and animal features. Antlers sprouted from its elongated skull, and its emaciated body gave it an otherworldly appearance. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear. Those glowing yellow orbs seemed to peer into my very soul, radiating an ancient, unfathomable malevolence. The creature let out a deafening shriek that sent us all staggering backward. In the chaos, I saw Marcus go down, the creature's claws raking across his back. "Marcus!" Olivia screamed, emptying her pistol into the beast's hide. The bullets seemed to have little effect, but the noise drove the creature back momentarily. Alex seized the opportunity, fumbling in his pack for the flare gun. "Ethan!" he yelled, tossing me the massive 4-gauge shotgun. "Take the shot!" I hefted the enormous weapon, its weight almost throwing me off balance. The creature was regrouping, its yellow eyes locked on me. Time seemed to slow as I raised the gun, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It felt like being hit by a truck, and I found myself on the ground, my shoulder screaming in pain. But I'd hit my mark. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech of pain, staggering backward. For a moment I thought we'd won, but then, to our horror, it straightened up. Where I'd hit it square in the chest, there was a gaping wound, but no blood. "What the hell is this thing?" Marcus groaned from the ground. Before any of us could react, the creature turned and bolted into the darkness of the forest, leaving us shaken and confused. We spent the next hour tending to Marcus's wounds and trying to make sense of what had happened. The claw marks on his back were deep, but thankfully not life-threatening. "Did you see that?" Olivia kept saying. "The bullets didn't even slow it down." Alex was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "This isn't possible. Things like that don't exist." But we had all seen it. We had all felt the terror of being in its presence. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion set in. We decided to make our way back to Alex's house, our mission to hunt the creature abandoned in favor of survival. The trek back was tense, each of us jumping at every sound. But we made it without further incident, collapsing on Alex's porch as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. We spent the next day recovering, trying to process what we had experienced. Marcus's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and we took turns keeping watch, paranoid that the creature might follow us back. As we prepared to leave, Alex pulled me aside. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "That thing is still out there." I nodded, knowing he was right. "What do we do?" "We research, we prepare, and when we're ready, we come back and end this once and for all." As I climbed into Marcus's truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter in Blackwater Forest was just the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying than we could imagine. It's been 2 months since our ill-fated expedition into Blackwater Forest. I've spent every spare moment researching, trying to find any information that might explain what we encountered. My searches have led me down dark paths, into forgotten folklore and suppressed histories. 2 possibilities keep surfacing: Skinwalker and Wendigo. Both are creatures of Native American legend. Both are said to be nearly unkillable. But the most disturbing development came 3 days ago. Alex called, his voice shaking with fear. "The creature has returned." He says it's been stalking his property, screaming in the night and leaving claw marks on his doors and windows. We're planning another expedition. This time we'll be even more prepared. But as I pack my bags and check my weapons, I can't shake the feeling that we're in over our heads. To anyone reading this, heed my warning. If you live near land that the Native Americans called cursed, stay away. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some nightmares are all too real. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a time to revel in the freedom and joy that the 4th of July brings. But for me and my two friends, Liam and Zoe, it turned into a nightmare that would haunt us for years to come. My name is Alex, and this is the story of how our innocent plans for fireworks and fun spiraled into a terrifying encounter with something beyond our comprehension. The day started like any other summer day in our small town of Oakwood. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the air was thick with humidity. Liam, Zoe, and I had been planning this night for weeks. We'd saved up our money to buy a stash of fireworks, both legal and, well, let's just say some were of questionable legality. Our plan was simple: head out to the edge of Blackwood Forest, set up our fireworks, and have our own private light show away from the prying eyes of adults and law enforcement. As we made our way through town, laden with backpacks full of explosives and snacks, the excitement was palpable. Liam, always the jokester, kept making terrible puns about how our night was going to be lit. Zoe rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her grin. I felt a sense of adventure, the thrill of doing something just a little bit rebellious. But as we approached the outskirts of Blackwood Forest, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a prickle at the back of my neck. I brushed it off, blaming it on the anticipation of the night ahead. We found a perfect spot, a small clearing just on the edge of the forest, with a view of the old Oakwood Bridge in the distance. The bridge would serve as our emergency escape route if any cops showed up to ruin our fun. As we set up our fireworks, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects strangely absent. I glanced over at Liam, who was meticulously arranging our pyrotechnic display, his brow furrowed in concentration. Zoe was sitting on a fallen log, scrolling through her phone, probably updating her social media about our epic night ahead. "Hey guys," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Does something feel off to you?" Liam looked up from his work, a quizzical expression on his face. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I replied, feeling foolish. "It's just really quiet out here." Zoe chimed in, not looking up from her phone. "It's probably just because it's getting dark. Animals are settling down for the night or whatever." I nodded, not entirely convinced, but not wanting to dampen the mood. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our little clearing, we finished our preparations. The air was thick with anticipation as we waited for full darkness to descend. That's when things started to get weird. It began with a smell. At first, it was just a faint whiff, something acrid and unpleasant. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew stronger. It was like rotten eggs mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place, but that made my stomach churn. "Do you guys smell that?" Liam asked, his nose wrinkled in disgust. Zoe nodded, covering her nose with her sleeve. "Ugh, gross. Maybe there's a dead animal nearby or something." I was about to agree when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was quick, just a flash of motion in the growing darkness, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. Liam followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "See what?" Before I could answer, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest, loud enough to make us all jump. The smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Zoe said, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we should pack up and go home." I was about to agree when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these woods. A sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably there, and it was calling my name. "Alex!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tell me you guys heard that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam and Zoe exchanged nervous glances. "Heard what?" Liam asked, his usual bravado replaced by uncertainty. Before I could explain, a series of sharp knocks echoed through the clearing. It sounded like someone or something was striking the trees around us in a rhythmic pattern. Panic set in. We scrambled to gather our things, abandoning the carefully arranged fireworks. As we turned to run, I caught sight of something emerging from the tree line. In the dim light, I could make out the vague shape of a deer, but something was terribly wrong. It stood on two legs, its body grotesquely emaciated, ribs protruding from its skin. And its eyes glowed with an otherworldly hunger. We ran. We ran faster than I thought possible, our feet pounding against the forest floor as we made for the old bridge. Behind us, I could hear the thing moving, its unnatural gait somehow keeping pace with our frantic flight. As we neared the bridge, a gunshot rang out, followed by an inhuman shriek. An old man stood at the edge of the forest, a shotgun in his hands. "Get inside!" he yelled, gesturing towards a nearby cabin. "Lock the doors and windows!" We didn't need to be told twice. We burst into the cabin, securing every entrance as the sounds of a struggle filtered through the walls. More gunshots, more inhuman screams, and then silence. We huddled together in the darkness, too terrified to make a sound. Minutes felt like hours as we waited, unsure if the nightmare was truly over. A knock at the door made us all jump. "It's safe now," the old man's voice called out. "You can come out." Hesitantly, we emerged from our hiding place. The old man introduced himself as Frank, a local who had lived on the edge of Blackwood Forest for decades. As we sat in his living room, still shaking from our ordeal, he explained what we had encountered. "That, kids, was a Wendigo," Frank said, his voice grave. "An ancient spirit of hunger and winter. It's been haunting these woods for the past month or so." As Frank spoke, the reality of what we had experienced began to sink in. We had come face to face with a creature of legend, a monster that shouldn't exist in our modern world. We stayed at Frank's cabin that night, too terrified to venture back into the darkness. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, we made our way back to town, forever changed by what we had witnessed. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Zoe threw herself into research, learning everything she could about Wendigos and other cryptids. Liam became withdrawn, jumping at every unexpected sound. And me? I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter wasn't over, that somehow the Wendigo had marked us. We made a pact never to speak of that night to anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But we also swore to stay vigilant, to watch out for each other and for any signs that the creature might return. As I sit here now, years later, writing down our story, I can't help but wonder, was that really the end? Or is the Wendigo still out there, waiting in the dark forests of Oakwood, hungry for its next victim? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the 4th of July the same way again. And if you're ever tempted to venture into the woods at night, remember our story. Because sometimes the monsters in the dark are all too real. 5 years have passed since that fateful 4th of July night. Liam, Zoe, and I tried to move on with our lives, but the memory of the Wendigo haunted us. We went our separate ways after high school. Liam to college on the West Coast, Zoe to an internship in New York, and me staying behind in Oakwood to help with the family business. We kept in touch sporadically, but our conversations were always tinged with an unspoken understanding. We never directly mentioned that night, but it lingered between us like a shadow. It was early June when I received a frantic call from Zoe. Her voice was trembling, and I could hear the fear in every word. "Alex," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "I saw it. Here in New York. It followed me." My blood ran cold. "Zoe, slow down. What do you mean you saw it?" She took a shaky breath. "I was walking home late from work and I saw something in an alley. It was tall, so thin, and its eyes. Alex, it was the same eyes." I tried to calm her down, to rationalize what she had seen. It was probably just her imagination, I said, the trauma playing tricks on her mind. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow. Over the next few weeks, strange reports began to surface. Livestock mutilations in rural areas outside of New York City, hikers going missing in state parks. And always there were whispers of a foul smell and eerie knocking sounds in the woods. I reached out to Liam, and his response chilled me to the bone. He had been having nightmares, vivid dreams of being chased through endless forests by something he couldn't see, but could feel breathing down his neck. It was happening again. The Wendigo was back, and it was hunting us. I knew what we had to do. I called Liam and Zoe, telling them to come back to Oakwood. We needed to end this, once and for all. As July 4th approached once again, we found ourselves back in Oakwood, preparing for a confrontation we never wanted but couldn't avoid. Frank, the old man who had saved us years ago, was gone. Passed away in his sleep last winter, the locals said. But his cabin still stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, a silent sentinel guarding dark secrets. We spent days researching, poring over old books on Native American legends and folklore. Zoe discovered an ancient ritual, said to bind and banish the Wendigo spirit. It was dangerous, requiring us to confront the creature directly, but it was our only hope. On the night of July 4th, as fireworks exploded in the sky above Oakwood, we made our way into Blackwood Forest. The smell hit us first, that same sickening mixture of rot and something otherworldly. Then came the knocking, echoing through the trees. Heart pounding, I called out into the darkness, "We know you're here. We've come to finish this." The forest fell silent. Then slowly, it emerged from the shadows. The Wendigo. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Its emaciated body twisted and elongated, antlers sprouting from its skull, and those eyes, those hungry, glowing eyes fixed upon us. What followed was a nightmare of chaos and terror. We ran, leading the creature deeper into the forest towards the clearing where we had prepared for the ritual. Zoe chanted in a language none of us understood, her voice rising above the Wendigo's unearthly shrieks. Liam and I worked to distract the creature, drawing its attention as Zoe completed the ritual. I felt its claws graze my back, felt its hot, putrid breath on my neck. But we persevered, driven by desperation and the need to end this horror once and for all. As Zoe spoke the final words of the ritual, the air around us seemed to vibrate. The Wendigo let out a bone-chilling howl, its body contorting in impossible ways. There was a flash of blinding light, and then silence. We stood there, panting and shaking, unsure if it was truly over. The forest around us seemed different somehow, lighter, as if a great darkness had been lifted. As dawn broke over Blackwood Forest, we made our way back to town. We were battered, bruised, and forever changed, but we had survived. The Wendigo was gone, banished by an ancient power we barely understood. In the years that followed, we kept a watchful eye on the forests around Oakwood. We never saw the Wendigo again, but sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can hear a distant knocking in the woods. And every 4th of July, as fireworks light up the sky, I remember the terror of those nights and the bonds forged in the face of unimaginable horror. Liam, Zoe, and I, we're more than friends now. We're survivors, guardians of a secret most of the world will never know or understand. And if the day ever comes when the Wendigo or something like it returns, we'll be ready, Because some battles don't end. Some horrors never truly die. They just wait in the shadows, hungry and patient, for the day when they can rise again. So if you're ever in Oakwood and you hear strange noises in the woods or catch a whiff of that unmistakable sickening smell, run, run, and don't look back. Because the night is dark and full of terrors that no firework can illuminate. And remember, not all legends are just stories. Some of them have teeth. 10 years have passed since our final confrontation with the Wendigo in Blackwood Forest. Life has a way of moving on, even after the most horrifying experiences. But the echoes of that night still reverberate through our lives. Liam, Zoe, and I have remained close, bound by a shared trauma that no one else could understand. We've tried to build normal lives, but normal is a relative term when you face the impossible. Liam became a park ranger, driven by a need to protect others from the dangers lurking in the wilderness. He's married now with a young daughter, but I've seen the way he scans the tree line at dusk, always alert, always watching. Zoe threw herself into anthropology and folklore studies. She's now a respected academic specializing in Native American legends. Her colleagues praise her insight, unaware that her knowledge comes from terrifying first-hand experience. As for me, I took over my family's bookstore in Oakwood. I've expanded our collection of local history and folklore, creating a subtle bulwark of knowledge against the darkness. It's my way of keeping watch, of staying prepared. We still gather every 4th of July, not to celebrate, but to remember. We meet at Frank's old cabin, which we jointly purchased and restored. It serves as both a memorial and a watchtower. Our vigils have been quiet, uneventful. The forests around Oakwood have remained peaceful. But we know better than to let our guard down completely. There have been incidents, nothing concrete, nothing we could point to as definitive proof that our old enemy has returned. But there are whispers. A hiker in the Adirondacks swearing he saw a deer walking on 2 legs in the twilight. A rash of unexplained livestock deaths in rural Maine, the carcasses found eerily drained of blood. A child in Wisconsin drawing pictures of a tall, skeletal figure with antlers, claiming it visits her in her dreams. Each time we hear these stories, we share knowing looks. We investigate as best we can from afar, ready to act if needed. So far, it's always been a false alarm, a trick of the light, or an overactive imagination. But we know the truth. The Wendigo may be gone, but other horrors lurk in the dark corners of the world. Our experiences have changed us, shaped us into unofficial guardians against threats most people couldn't comprehend. We've made connections with others who have brushed against the supernatural, a network of watchful eyes spanning the country. Last month I received a package. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten accounts of Wendigo encounters dating back centuries. The sender remained anonymous, but the message was clear. We're not alone in this fight. As I write this final entry, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought us here. We were just kids looking for a thrill on a summer night, and we stumbled into a world of ancient horrors and primal fears. We lost our innocence, but we gained a purpose. To those who might read this account in the future, I leave you with this warning. The world is older and stranger than you know. There are things that lurk in the shadows, hungry things that see humans as nothing more than prey. But there are also those who stand against the darkness, armed with knowledge, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of shared experience. So if you're ever in the woods and you hear an unnatural knocking, if you catch a whiff of that unforgettable rotting smell, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Remember our story. Remember that the legends are real and they have teeth. And if you're brave enough, if you're called to join this secret war against the shadows, know that you're not alone. There are others out there, watching, waiting, and ready to stand with you against whatever horrors the night may bring. As for Liam, Zoe, and me, We'll be here in Oakwood, keeping our vigil. Because some battles never truly end, and some duties, once taken up, can never be set aside. The Wendigo taught us that, and we'll never forget. 20 years have passed since our first encounter with the Wendigo. 2 decades of vigilance, of watching the shadows, of jumping at every unexplained sound in the night. But nothing lasts forever, not even supernatural vigilance. It began with a phone call from Zoe. Her voice was tight with fear, a tone I hadn't heard in years. "Alex," she said, "it's happening again, but this time it's different." Zoe had been tracking a pattern of disappearances across the northern states. At first they seemed random, a hiker here, a camper there. But as she mapped them out, a chilling picture emerged. The incidents were forming a spiral, and at the center of that spiral was Oakwood. Whatever we had faced, whatever we had banished all those years ago, it was coming back, and it was bringing friends. I called Liam immediately. He was already on his way, having seen the same patterns in his work as a park ranger. Within 24 hours, we were all back in Oakwood, our old base of operations at Frank's cabin, humming with activity. The air was thick with tension as we pored over maps, news reports, and ancient texts. Zoe's research had uncovered a terrifying truth. What we faced wasn't just a Wendigo, but an ancient spirit that could take many forms, each more horrifying than the last. And now, it was gathering its strength for a final assault. As if confirming our fears, reports started flooding in from around Oakwood. Livestock mutilations, strange sightings in the woods, and that all too familiar smell of decay hanging in the air. The townsfolk were scared, and they were looking to us for answers. We knew we couldn't face this alone. Over the years, we had built a network of allies, other survivors, researchers, and even a few open-minded law enforcement officers. We called in every favor, every resource we had. The night of the summer solstice, we made our stand. The forests around Oakwood became a battleground between the world we knew and horrors beyond imagination. Wendigos, skinwalkers, and things that defied description emerged from the darkness, driven by an insatiable hunger. Our preparations paid off. Silver bullets, blessed weapons, and rituals gathered from a dozen different cultures. We threw everything we had at them. The night was filled with inhuman shrieks, gunfire, and the chanting of ancient banishing rites. In the heart of the chaos, I found myself face to face with a creature that I knew, somehow, was the same entity we had encountered all those years ago. It was larger now, more powerful, its eyes burning with a hatred that was all too human. "You," it spoke, its voice a rasp that seemed to claw at my very soul. "You who have denied us for so long, your fear has made us strong, your vigilance has made us cunning, and now you will feed us for eternity." But we were no longer the scared teenagers we once were. We had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. With Liam on my right and Zoe on my left, we stood our ground. The battle that followed was like something out of a nightmare. We were battered, bloodied, and pushed to our very limits. But as the first light of dawn broke over the trees, we found ourselves still standing. The creatures of the night retreated, their inhuman wails fading into the distance. We had won, but the victory came at a cost. Many of our allies had fallen. The forests around Oakwood were scarred, bearing the marks of our supernatural conflict. And we knew deep in our hearts that this was only a respite, not a final victory. In the days that followed, as we tended to our wounds and mourned our losses, we came to a decision. We couldn't keep fighting this battle alone, always reacting, always on the defensive. It was time to take the fight to them. With the help of our remaining allies, we established the Oakwood Institute officially, a research center dedicated to local history and folklore. Unofficially, it became a training ground for a new generation of guardians, people dedicated to standing against the darkness that lurks at the edges of our world. Liam, Zoe, and I became teachers, passing on our knowledge, our experiences, and our warnings to those willing to take up the mantle. We're no longer on the front lines. Our battles have left us too scarred, too worn for that. But we've made sure that when the darkness rises again, and there will be others ready to face it. As for the Wendigo and its kin, they're still out there, watching, waiting. We can feel them sometimes on cold nights when the wind howls through the trees. But they fear us now as much as we once feared them. They know that humanity is no longer helpless prey, but a force to be reckoned with. Our story began with 3 frightened teenagers on a 4th of July night, facing something they could barely comprehend. It ends with those same 3, older and wiser, having built a legacy that will endure long after we're gone. To those who come after us, who might read these words and feel called to join this secret war, know this: the night is dark and full of terrors, yes. But so long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, there will always be hope. The Wendigo taught us fear. We learned to turn that fear into strength, and that perhaps is the greatest victory of all. 50 years have passed since that fateful 4th of July night when 3 teenagers stumbled upon a horror beyond imagination. Liam, Zoe, and I, we're old now, our hair gray, our faces lined with the years of battling both seen and unseen threats. The Oakwood Institute has flourished beyond our wildest dreams. What started as a desperate measure to prepare for future supernatural threats has become a global network of guardians, researchers, and allies. Our story, once a closely guarded secret, has become a foundational text for those who walk the path between the known world and the shadows that lurk beyond. But time, as they say, comes for us all. Liam was the first to go. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his last day spent teaching a group of young recruits how to track creatures that leave no tracks. We buried him on the edge of Blackwood Forest, a guardian even in death. Zoe followed a few years later. Her brilliant mind, which had unraveled so many supernatural mysteries, succumbed to the all-too-natural ravages of Alzheimer's. In her lucid moments, she would speak of the Wendigo, of the battles we fought, her eyes bright with the fire that had driven her all these years. We laid her to rest beside Liam, under the trees they both protected for so long. And now, as I write these final words, I know my time is short. The doctors speak in hushed tones outside my hospital room, but I don't need their prognosis. I can feel it in my bones, in the scars left by claws and teeth that should not exist. My fight is nearly over, but I am not afraid. Not anymore. Last night, as the machines beeped their steady rhythm and the moon cast long shadows across my room, I saw them. Liam and Zoe, young again, as they were on that long-ago summer night. They stood at the foot of my bed, smiling, waiting. And behind them, in the darkness beyond my room, I caught a glimpse of antlers, of glowing eyes. But there was no malice there, no hunger, only recognition, respect perhaps, from one old warrior to another. I close my eyes, ready for whatever comes next. In my mind, I'm young again too, running through the woods with my friends, the summer air warm on my skin. But this time, we're not running from something. We're running towards something, towards an adventure that never truly ends. To those who find this account, who carry on the work we began, remember this. The world is vast and full of wonders, both beautiful and terrible. The things that go bump in the night are real, yes, but so is courage, so is friendship, so is the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We faced our demons, both literal and figurative. We turned our fear into strength, our trauma into purpose, and in doing so we left the world a little safer, a little more prepared for the darkness that ebbs and flows like the tide. Our story began with fireworks and terror. It ends with a quieter bang. The impact of lives lived in service to a cause greater than ourselves. The Wendigo taught us fear. We learned to teach others courage. And now, as the last of the old guard fades into memory, I leave you with this final thought. The night is dark, but you are the light. Stand tall, stand together, and never stop watching the shadows. For in those shadows lie not just monsters, but the chance to discover the hero within yourself. Goodbye, and good hunting. Alex. The journal ends here, the last word slightly shaky but clear. Tucked into the final pages is a photograph, faded with age. 3 teenagers smile at the camera, fireworks bursting in the sky behind them. On the back, written in a steady hand, Liam, Zoe, Alex, July 4th, the night everything changed. The steady beep of the heart monitor slowed, then flatlined. Alex, the last of the original trio who faced the Wendigo all those years ago, had passed on. The nurses rushed in, but it was too late. The story, it seemed, had come to its natural end. But for Alex, it was just the beginning. There was a moment of darkness, a sensation of weightlessness, and then awareness. Alex opened eyes that were no longer bound by mortal flesh and gazed upon a world beyond imagination. The realm Alex now inhabited defied easy description. It was a place where thought became reality, where the boundaries between what was and what could be blurred into insignificance. And there, waiting with warm smiles and open arms, were Liam and Zoe. "Took you long enough," Liam said with a grin, looking just as he did on that fateful 4th of July night. Zoe laughed, her eyes sparkling with the brilliance that had unraveled so many mysteries in life. "We've got so much to show you, Alex." As Alex embraced them, the true nature of this new existence began to unfold. They weren't just spirits or memories. They had become something more. Guardians of the veil between worlds, custodians of the balance between the natural and supernatural. And they weren't alone. Shapes moved in the periphery of this liminal space, other guardians, other beings. Some were once human, others had never known mortal form, and among them, to Alex's shock, was a familiar antlered figure. The Wendigo approached, no longer a creature of hunger and madness, but a being of primal power and ancient wisdom. It spoke, its voice resonating not through air but through the very fabric of reality. "The cycle is complete," it said. "The hunted become the hunters become the guardians, and the guardians become us." Understanding flooded through Alex. The Wendigo, the creatures they had fought, they weren't simply monsters. They were part of a greater balance, a cosmic dance of light and shadow, order and chaos. And now, Alex, Liam, and Zoe had joined that dance. Their new role became clear. From this vantage point beyond mortal concerns, they could guide, protect, and maintain the delicate balance between worlds. The Oakwood Institute, their life's work, was just the beginning, a first step in humanity's journey towards understanding its place in a universe far stranger and more wondrous than anyone had imagined. They watched over the world they had left behind. They saw new guardians rise, faced with challenges both familiar and unprecedented. Sometimes, when the need was great, they could reach across the veil, a whispered warning in the wind, a crucial piece of lore appearing in a dream, a surge of strength to a guardian in their darkest hour. And on quiet nights, when the boundary between worlds grew thin, they would return to the forests around Oakwood. Not as the terrified teenagers they once were, nor as the battle-hardened guardians they became, but as something transcendent, embodiments of the very magic and mystery they had spent their lives trying to understand. To those who walk the woods on such nights, who stand vigil against the darkness, a message echoes, not in words, but in the rustle of leaves, in the pattern of shadows, in the space between heartbeats. You are not alone. The night is dark, but magic is real. And in the end, it is not the monsters we defeat that define us, but the journey we undertake, the bonds we forge, and the legacy we leave behind. Watch, learn, grow. For one day, you too may join this eternal dance. And so, the story that began with a single night of terror comes full circle. But it does not end. It simply transforms, as all great tales do, into legend. A legend that will inspire, guide, and protect for generations to come. In the forests of Oakwood and beyond, the whispers continue. The dance goes on. And somewhere in the space between what is and what could be, three friends laugh together, forever young, forever guardians, forever part of the great mystery that is existence itself. Some kids ask for video games or sports equipment for their birthdays. I asked for an emergency survival bag. Not just any basic kit, but a specific brown canvas backpack I'd researched meticulously. 3 days of supplies for 4 people, comprehensive first aid equipment, multiple fire starting methods, and redundant light sources. When I opened it on my 13th birthday, my parents exchanged worried glances, but I felt like I'd received the keys to survival itself. That bag became my foundation. Every weekend I'd lay out its contents on my bedroom floor, studying each item, learning its uses, imagining scenarios. I added tools methodically. First a better knife, then a more advanced first aid kit, eventually a complete water filtration system. My room transformed into what my mother jokingly called the Apocalypse Preparation Center. School projects became excuses for deeper research. History assignments turned into studies of past societal collapses. Science papers focused on sustainable agriculture and water purification. While other kids played video games, I learned about off-grid power systems and long-term food storage. My interest wasn't born from paranoia, at least that's what I told myself. It came from a deep-seated need to be prepared, to have control in a world that often seemed chaotic. Every new skill mastered, every supply cached, felt like another layer of security against an uncertain future. By my mid-20s, I'd amassed enough knowledge and equipment to outfit a small community. But something was missing. Living in an apartment, my preparations felt theoretical. I needed a permanent base, somewhere I could truly implement everything I'd learned. The search for property consumed 2 years. Real estate agents quickly learned my criteria: remote location, defensible position, water access, and most importantly, a basement, or the potential for underground construction. I looked at dozens of properties, mapping out escape routes and defensive positions for each one. Then I found it, 12 acres of possibility, crowned with an abandoned farmhouse that most buyers would consider a teardown. But I saw past the peeling paint and rotting porches. What caught my attention was the basement. Solid concrete walls, high ceilings, and enough square footage to create something extraordinary. Meeting my wife was like finding the missing piece of a survival kit. She didn't laugh at my preparations. She understood them. On our third date, she showed me her own bug-out bag and offered suggestions for improving my water storage system. Like me, she saw preparedness not as paranoia, but as a rational response to an irrational world. We honeymooned by taking wilderness survival courses together. While other couples collected china patterns, we collected topographical maps and military surplus gear. Together, we transformed that old basement into something that would make most doomsday preppers envious. Converting the basement took 3 years of weekends and every spare dollar we could muster. We started with structural reinforcement, additional concrete support columns, steel beam reinforcements, and blast-resistant doors that could withstand significant pressure. The main entrance door alone weighed over 500 pounds and cost more than a used car. The ventilation system was a masterpiece of redundancy. 3 separate air filtration units, each capable of handling nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. Backup power came from a combination of solar panels and a generator system that could run for months on stored fuel. Water storage tanks lined the walls, supplemented by a rainwater collection system and multiple filtration methods. We installed security cameras covering every approach to the house, their feeds monitored by a system that could detect and analyze movement. The cameras connected to a closed-circuit system with its own power supply, completely independent from the grid. Food storage took up an entire room, freeze-dried supplies, rotating stock of canned goods, and seeds for future cultivation. We had enough to sustain 6 people for 2 years without outside contact. Every entrance had multiple layers of protection. The main door used a 3-lock system: mechanical, electronic, and biometric. Backup exits were concealed and fortified. We installed emergency lighting that could run for months on stored power, and communication systems that would work even if the entire grid went down. The perimeter had subtle security features: motion sensors disguised as garden lights, cameras hidden in birdhouses, and warning systems that could alert us to approaching vehicles or people. Everything was carefully concealed to look like normal farm equipment or rural debris. That night started routinely enough. I was installing upgrades to our ventilation system, a new filtration unit that could handle higher volumes of air while consuming less power. The work required intense concentration. Each connection had to be perfect to maintain the system's integrity. The basement had become my sanctuary. The thick concrete walls blocked all outside noise, creating a cocoon of focused silence. The ventilation system's quiet hum provided a mechanical lullaby that often made me lose track of time. Looking back, maybe that sense of security made me careless. I'd violated one of our cardinal rules by leaving the main entry door open. We never did that, not just for security, but to maintain the illusion that the basement was just another abandoned farm remnant. Sound carries strangely at night in the country, and the last thing we wanted was some curious neighbor hearing power tools coming from a supposedly empty building. Her voice cut through my concentration like a knife. "Hey, come up here!" It was my wife's voice, perfectly recreated, down to the slight upturn she uses when calling me. But something in my brain registered wrong before I consciously processed it. She was supposed to be working late at the hospital, pulling a 12-hour shift that wouldn't end for hours. I straightened up from the ventilation unit, tools still in hand, and that's when I noticed the open door. Security protocol demanded I check the cameras first. We had a whole bank of monitors showing every approach to the house. But I recognized her voice. Why waste time checking cameras when I knew it was her? The voice came again as I climbed the stairs, echoing strangely in the old house's shell. We'd left the upper structure largely untouched, maintaining its abandoned appearance as camouflage for what lay beneath. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet. We deliberately left them that way as an early warning system. The front porch offered a clear view of our property in the moonlight. The field stretched out before me, silvered by the full moon, ending at the tree line about 50 yards away. No sign of my wife, no sign of her Jeep. The rational part of my brain started sending urgent warnings. I called her name several times, each call seemingly swallowed by the unnaturally still night air. No response, not even an echo. The silence felt heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a storm breaks. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, futuristic-looking building, all gleaming metal and tinted glass. Surrounding it were what looked like military-grade security measures, armed guards, security cameras, even what appeared to be some kind of energy fence shimmer. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove towards the complex. This was no farm equipment delivery. I was in way over my head, and I knew it. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I had to see this through. As I approached the main building, a group of men in dark suits emerged from a side entrance. They didn't look like farmers or warehouse workers. They looked like government agents, or maybe corporate security. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and confusion. I brought the truck to a stop where they indicated and climbed down from the cab on shaky legs. One of the men, a tall, lean figure with close-cropped gray hair, stepped forward. "Mr. Wilkes," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Thank you for making this delivery. I'm Mr. Johnson. If you'll follow me, we can complete the paperwork and get you on your way." I wanted to run, to jump back in my truck and flee, but I knew I'd never make it past the gate. So I nodded, following Mr. Johnson towards the building. The other men fell in behind us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being escorted to my doom. Inside, the building was a maze of sterile white corridors and locked doors with keypad entries. We passed laboratories where I caught glimpses of complex equipment and people in hazmat suits. What kind of place was this? Finally, we entered a large office. Mr. Johnson sat behind the desk and gestured for me to take a seat opposite him. The other men remained standing, blocking the door. "Mr. Wilkes," Johnson began, "I imagine you have questions." I laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. "Yeah, you could say that. What is this place? What's really in my truck?" Johnson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's in your truck, Mr. Wilkes, is exactly what you were told. Farm equipment, but not the kind you're thinking of." He pressed a button on his desk, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was footage from a highway at night. A tall, dark figure stood in the middle of the road, the same figure I had seen at the rest stop. But as I watched, the figure changed. Its form shifted, limbs elongating, skin rippling. In a matter of seconds, it had transformed into a creature that looked like something out of a nightmare, all sharp angles and gleaming carapace. "What you encountered, Mr. Wilkes," Johnson said, his voice calm, "was not human. It's a being from elsewhere. We've been tracking its activities for months now." My mind reeled. "But what does this have to do with me? With my delivery?" Johnson leaned forward. "The farm equipment in your truck is actually highly specialized containment and research gear. We're going to capture this entity, study it. And you, Mr. Wilkes, have just delivered the final pieces we needed." I felt sick. "So all those missing truckers, all those incidents—" "Regrettable casualties," Johnson said, his tone matter-of-fact, "but necessary for the greater good. This being represents technology beyond our wildest dreams. If we can harness its abilities, the possibilities are endless." I stood up, anger overriding my fear. "You've been using us as bait, sending truckers out there knowing what could happen." Johnson's eyes hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Wilkes. You're in no position to take the moral high ground. You've been part of this operation from the moment you accepted this job." As if on cue, one of the men behind me placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, forcing me back into my seat. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Johnson smiled again, and this time it was predatory. "Now, Mr. Wilkes, you have a choice to make. You can join us, be part of something world-changing, or—" He let the alternative hang in the air, unspoken but clear. I looked around the room, at the impassive faces of the men surrounding me, at the nightmare creature frozen on the screen. I thought about all the truckers who had disappeared, about the terror I'd felt on the road. And I thought about what might happen if this entity, this technology, fell into the wrong hands. In that moment, I made my decision. "I'm in," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "What do you need me to do?" Johnson's smile widened. "Excellent choice, Mr. Wilkes. We'll start by having you make another run, but this time you'll be carrying some very special cargo." As he began to outline the plan, I felt a part of myself withering away. I was no longer just Frank Wilkes, long-haul trucker. I was now complicit in something dark and dangerous, something that blurred the lines between science fiction and horror. But I was alive, and in this new world I'd stumbled into, that was no small thing. As I left the complex later that day, my truck loaded with equipment I didn't understand, and a mind burdened with knowledge I never wanted, I couldn't help but laugh at the bitter irony. I'd spent my life on the open road, cherishing the freedom it gave me. Now that same road had become my prison. I merged onto I-95, heading north this time. The highway stretched out before me, familiar yet forever changed, and somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, I knew it was waiting, watching. The hunt was on. And this time, I was the hunter. But as the miles rolled by and the sun dipped below the horizon, a nagging question gnawed at the back of my mind. In this deadly game of cat and mouse, who was really the predator and who was the prey? Only time would tell. And out here on the long, dark highway, time was the one thing I had plenty of.